And it's my privilege this evening to introduce the Cheng Family Foundation lecturer, Professor Mae Ngai, who also holds the Cheng Foundation Fellowship. Mae Ngai is Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia University. She holds her first degree from SUNY Empire State College and her graduate degrees, her MA, her MPhil, and her PhD from Columbia. Her first academic position, her first faculty position, was at the University of Chicago, where she taught from 1998, and then moved on to Columbia in 2006. She's the author of Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens and the Making of Modern America, which was published by Princeton in 2004, and The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, which appeared in 2010, and also the co-editor with John Guerra of Major Problems in US Immigration and Ethnic History. That first book, to which I just referred, Impossible Subjects, won no less than 6 separate academic prizes from the Organization of American Historians, the American Historical Association, and various other organizations testifying to its groundbreaking significance in the field of Chinese immigration. And that long list, I think, helps explain why Professor Ngai has been a serial offender when it comes to holding fellowships. Twice at the Huntington, and then this is a very, very long list, which I'm going to extract. The Social Science Research Council, New York University Law School, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars at New York Public Library, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. She's also held visiting professorships both in Paris and in China. She's currently working on a book tentatively entitled Yellow and Gold, Chinese Gold Miners, the Chinese Question and Global Politics. And it's from that project that this evening's talk is taken. The title of her Cheng Foundation lecture this evening is The Chinese Question, the Gold Rushes and Global Politics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Mae Ngai.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hindle, and I wish to thank the Huntington Library, Jennifer Cheng and the Cheng Foundation for the honor of being the Cheng Fellow here this spring and for giving you this lecture tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Around the turn of the last century, some half-dozen countries enacted laws that prohibited Chinese immigration. These countries constituted an arc that ranged from the Americas across the Pacific to Australasia, and then across the Indian Ocean to South Africa. The late political scientist Aristide Zolberg called it the Great Wall against China. The conventional explanation for Chinese exclusion is that Euro-American workers in the receiving countries feared competition from cheap Chinese labor. And indeed, this perception was widespread. But there was something special, something more about the Chinese question that emerged in the late 19th century. It carried an unmistakable whiff of racism, and it appeared to be a global problem. But how Chinese immigration came to be seen as a global problem, a global race problem, has not been adequately explained. At one level, we might note the obvious, that global ideas emerge in a global environment. And to be sure, the period between 1875 and the First World War was one of unprecedented global integration, achieved through the increased circulation of people, capital, goods, and ideas. But we might pause and ask, why do some ideas become global and not others? How do ideas acquire global force? Now, there were, of course, general stereotypes about China that circulated in the West since the early 19th century. Orientalist constructions about the stagnation and despotism of the East that served to define the progress and vigor of the West, perhaps most famously expressed by Hegel in his lectures on the philosophy of history published in 1805. But in the late 19th century, these ideas were too general, too vague to have political force on the ground. In important ways, the local was the generative side of politics, to paraphrase Tip O'Neill. But politics also travel, as it were, and borrow from and copy the ideas and policies of others. There's a dynamic interplay between local and global politics, and it's that relationship that interests me. I should also note here that what appears as a global Chinese question was more precisely a phenomenon of the Anglo-American world. So this directs our attention to a more specific question about the role of Chinese exclusion in the trajectory of British and American power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I begin with the gold rushes because they were the first occasions of large-scale contact between Euro-Americans and Chinese, which contact took place in the context of the globalization of trade, credit, and labor. In the span of 50 years, more gold was extracted from the earth than in the previous 3,000 years. We might think of the 19th century gold rushes as an economic stimulus, a new stage of capital accumulation, which made possible the expansion of world trade and, in particular, the rise of Great Britain and the United States as the world's leading investor and creditor nations. The gold rushes also launched into motion hundreds of thousands of people from the British Isles, continental Europe, the Americas, Australasia, and China. In California and in the colony of Victoria in Australia, Chinese comprised upwards of 25% of the mining population in the 1850s and 60s. The gold fields were fluid international contact zones on the frontiers of the world's core societies. Many miners were serial rushers, but others settled down and became idealized by their descendants for their democratic and entrepreneurial spirit. They marked the advent of settler colonialism, which congealed the frontier, to paraphrase Jürgen Ostenhammel. Without exception, these polities excluded the Chinese. Most studies on the Chinese exclusion movements tend to view anti-Chinese racism as a homogeneous global idea. In my research, I've been struck by the differences in the Chinese question on the ground, especially during the gold rush period. The global Chinese question did not emerge fully formed like Athena from Zeus's head. It shifted and evolved as it moved across and shaped the Pacific world. What follows then is a kind of travelogue of the Chinese question as an idea or a set of ideas which over the course of several decades acquired the status and force of a global idea, and the role of that idea in the rise of Anglo-American hegemony. We start in California, where the discovery of gold on the North Fork of the American River in January 1848 drew prospectors from the eastern and southern United States, from Hawaii, Mexico, and Chile, from Great Britain and Europe, from Australia, and from China. In the early fevered days of the rush, white Americans found nativism a convenient weapon of competition. It's all for us, not for you, a crude expression of American manifest destiny. By 1850, they had already successfully driven from the goldfields Mexicans, South Americans, and many Europeans. Anti-foreign sentiment then zeroed in on the Chinese, who were just arriving in large numbers in the early 1850s. And the Chinese were also arriving when placer or surface mining was beginning to give out, so anti-foreign feeling now mixed with the bitterness of dashed hopes. In 1852, the argument against Chinese took on a special cast, with white Americans accusing them of being indentured workers or coolies, imagined as slaves or semi-slaves. In fact, Chinese miners worked in a variety of ways, least of which was under contract. They mostly worked as independent prospectors, as this miner here with his rocker, and in small cooperative groups, as well as for wages for white-owned companies. These practices were common among miners across ethnic lines. Chinese hired on wages also built many of the flumes for the water companies, and they also worked extensively in hydraulic mining. The North Bloomfield Mining Company in Nevada County hired 800 Chinese and 300 whites in its ditches. But if Chinese were not actually indentured, the larger fiction that they were a coolie race overwhelmed any inconvenience of fact. Anti-coolieism imagined Chinese as innately servile, without individual personality or will, regardless of their actual condition. It was a kind of racial shorthand that drew on two comparisons. First, it recalled the so-called coolie trade of indentured Asian labor to the former slave plantation colonies. And second, much closer to home, it associated Chinese with African slavery in the American South. That second association positioned Chinese immediately as a racial threat to free labor. The coolie trope was actually not invented on the goldfields, but in Sacramento, as a weapon in the first chapter of California state politics. As early as 1850, some California elites were promoting grandiose visions of developing a new empire along the Pacific slope, one that potentially would stretch from Alaska to Chile. Some saw Chinese labor as key to development. Labor they believed to be potentially unlimited in supply, and at this time, before the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, more readily accessible than labor from east of the Rockies. The proposals to develop the Pacific Coast with Chinese labor varied in concept. For example, the Presbyterian minister William Speer imagined Chinese labor in California as part of a grand vision of Sino-American unity. Speer promoted a mutual embrace between China and the United States, one that would be based on friendship, commerce, and cultural exchange. He believed Chinese workers were willing, honorable, and industrious. Moreover, they knew how to cultivate cotton, tea, and silk, which Speer believed could be planted in California profitably. Other Californians drew inspiration from the practice of importing indentured Chinese and Indian labor to the British plantation colonies of the Caribbean after the abolition of slavery. In January of 1852, two California legislators, George Tingley and Archibald Peachy, introduced bills into the state, Senate, and Assembly, respectively, to enable the recruitment of foreign workers under contract into California. Each envisioned importing Chinese labor under contracts that would be, in principle, voluntary. The coolie bills proposed that the state guarantee labor contracts made abroad between American citizens or companies and foreign workers for work in the United States. Peachy's bill set a minimum contract at 5 years and Tingley's at 10 years, which exceeded anything in the Caribbean or elsewhere, and with wages of $50 a year, a pathetically low amount. Workers who broke their contracts could be punished with imprisonment and fines, penal sanctions that recalled the master-servant laws that had been dead letter among white Americans since the 1820s. Tingley and Peachy were not interested in contracting labor for gold mining, but for agriculture. The Assembly passed the Peachy bill, but opposition to the Tingley bill gathered force from free soilers, and Tingley was outmaneuvered in the state Senate, which defeated his bill 16-2. And without a Senate bill, the Peachy bill died on the vine. Now, opponents of the coolie bills were not necessarily against all Chinese immigrants. The daily Alta California supported free immigration and thought the principle should apply to all, regardless of origin. The Alta opposed bringing a system of servitude to California. It warned that recent experience with the labor contract system in the English colonies, that is in the Caribbean, showed that the work, quote, though voluntary, is hard and sometimes cruel, unquote, and considered by many in the same class as slavery. The distinction made by the Alta between free and indentured Chinese immigrants quickly blurred. Governor John Bigler was largely to blame for this obfuscation. Although the coolie bills were dead, the governor could not help but give the issue another kick. On April 23rd, Bigler issued a special message to the legislature. He raised alarm over, quote, the wholesale importation to this country of Asiatic coolies, unquote. He warned there would soon be 100,000 Chinese in the state and declared that nearly all will be being hired by Chinese masters to mine for gold at pitiable wages, $3 or $4 a month. Bigler called upon the legislature to impose heavy taxes on Chinese to check immigration and for a law barring Chinese contract labor from California mines. The coolie bills were dead, and Chinese in California were not indentured labor, so what was Bigler's purpose? Bigler had won his first election in 1851 by a mere 1,000 votes. In 1853, he would be running for re-election, and he needed to excite the mining districts to his side. The 49ers were restive, as the plasters were rapidly giving out, and a diligent miner could now only make $5 a day. Many were already working on wages for others earning about the same. By tarring all Chinese miners as coolies, Bigler found a quick and easy racial trope that compared Chinese to black slaves, the antithesis of free labor, casting them as a threat to white miners' independence. The newspapers published Bigler's address, and the governor also printed it as a leaflet and distributed it throughout the mining districts. As he had intended, Bigler roused the white mining population. His speech gave white miners license to attack Chinese and their property, and it provided an ideological theme that rallied a movement for exclusion. Within weeks of his speech, miners in Columbia and Tuolumne County met and voted to exclude Chinese from mining in their district. The resolution railed against those who would, quote, flood the state with degraded Asiatics and fasten, without the sanction of law, the system of peonage on our social organization, unquote. Across the state, miners' assemblies passed anti-Chinese resolutions, bidding them to leave their districts or, more pragmatically, forbidding them from first ownership of claims, which enabled whites to sell their worked-over claims when they left to chase another gold strike. The idea that Chinese were unfree became widespread. The mining and scientific press, for example, called Chinese, not just miners, but all Chinese, coolies, slave labor, a degraded race that was, quote, morally impossible to civilize, unquote. Racist theories about Chinese labor continued as the nature of gold mining changed, as the placers declined and mining shifted to highly capitalized underground or hard rock operations or quartz mining. Both whites and Chinese worked for the big mining companies for wages. Contemporary observers noted that, quote, brawny pigtail wearers, unquote, were working in the deep mines at Mariposa, shoulder to shoulder with Cornish men as late as 1870. But Chinese also persisted in independent mining. The solidarities of their hometown associations and brotherhood societies sustained their cooperative ventures. White miners regarded them as pathetic operations with meager yields, suitable only for unambitious coolies. In fact, Chinese used sophisticated water techniques learned from farming in southern China, and while data on yields are scant, they may well have been greater than whites commonly believed. The Chinese egalitarian cooperatives might also be understood as a refuge from capitalist wage relations. White miners did not have analogous cultural resources to resist the turn to wage labor. So when capitalist mining came to dominate the scene, independent white prospectors traded their autonomy for the relative security of a job, or they quit mining altogether. The use of Chinese gang labor, first seen in the construction of mining infrastructures like flumes and ditches, and later in the building of the railroad, further confirmed white Americans' beliefs that Chinese were held in bondage. In fact, ethnic gang labor can be traced to the contracting of Irish workers to dig canals in northern states, from the building of the Erie Canal in the late 1810s through the 1840s. In the antebellum North, contemporaries considered Irish navvies to be rough and intemperate, but nobody called them slaves, which obviously they were not. But after the Civil War, contracted labor assumed an ambiguous place in American political culture, which had drawn a bright line between servitude and slavery on the one hand and free labor on the other. But as free labor came increasingly to mean waged work and not independent artisanship or farming, drawing a line against contracted ethnic labor was a way for native white workers to address their own sense of precariousness. The association of ethnic and racial others with unfreedom enabled this construction, which otherwise was not so clear-cut. Indeed, race obfuscated the ambiguities in concepts like free labor, voluntary migration, and especially the contract. As freedom of contract became the watchword of free labor under laissez-faire capitalism, the contract remained associated with indenture and servility for the Chinese. Anti-coolieism remained foundational in the 1870s and 80s as an urban workingmen's movement and state party politics drove the Chinese question to national exclusion legislation in 1882. In Australia, conditions were similar to those in the American West. An international rush, followed by the discovery of placer deposits in 1854, followed by a shift to capitalized quartz mining. As in California, Chinese miners engaged in independent prospecting, small companies, and egalitarian cooperatives. They also worked for wages for European-owned companies. And, as in California, they organized themselves into the same kinds of hometown associations and brotherhood societies that were common across the Chinese diaspora. Racism towards Chinese on the Australian goldfields was more inchoate than in California. There was racial tension and conflict, and a few anti-Chinese riots, some of which seemed to have been instigated by Americans. They all seemed to take place on July 4th. But white miners aimed their ire chiefly at the colonial government, which required an expensive miner's license and policed the goldfields to ensure compliance. Although many Europeans disdained the Chinese, they did not allege that the Chinese were indentured or enslaved. I think that's because the legacy of unfreedom in Australia was not racialized African slavery, but convict transportation of the English and Irish poor. More important in their perceptions of Chinese were fears generated by their location at the fringes of the British Empire. The Melbourne Argus explained, quote, "Geographically, we are nearer the pent-up millions of China than any other large tract of country occupied by the white man," unquote. Australians obsessed over their fragile hold on the continent and their vulnerability in a larger contest in Asia between two empires, China and Britain. In Victoria, anti-Chinese agitation clashed with official colonial policy of equal protection. That principle, enshrined in precepts of Enlightenment liberalism, was a conceit belied by Britain's vast empire acquired through violence and dispossession. In general, Victoria conceded to and protected European interests. But the colonial government did oppose individual and group violence against Chinese, and police were more likely to arrest and prosecute Europeans who committed crimes against Chinese in Victoria than they were in California. The colonial government compensated Chinese for losses suffered during a riot in the Buckland River Valley in 1857. And it's also worth noting that, unlike California, some Chinese miners married European women and started families. Chinese and European miners continued to work claims side by side in the Victoria gullies. The coolie trope did not enter Australian politics until the late 1870s and 80s, and it came not from the goldfields of Victoria or New South Wales, but from the so-called top end, where controversy grew over the use of Asian and Pacific Islander contract labor in Queensland and in the Northern Territory. White Australians had conceded the use of colored labor on plantations in the tropical far north. But the problem in Australia was that the tropical areas were not separate islands like Jamaica or Mauritius, but contiguous to the temperate zones, which Europeans had staked out for themselves. By the late 1870s and 80s, whites in Australia were becoming increasingly alarmed at the growth and mobility of the Chinese population from the far north. The Chinese question was a core element of an emergent Australian nationalism, which viewed racial homogeneity and free labor as conditions for democracy. This was a new ideological formation, forcefully masculinist and racist. Anti-Chinese leagues sprang up in big cities like Melbourne and Sydney, even though the Chinese urban population was tiny and economic competition was negligible. In 1878, the Seamen's Union struck the Australian Steam Navigation Company to protest its use of Chinese sailors on its vessels, a reminder of the racial stakes in the Pacific world. References in the Australian press to the California exclusion movement were frequent and explicit. Australian newspapers reported regularly on the speeches of Dennis Carney, San Francisco's notorious Sandlot orator. Many made direct comparisons between the ruinous effects of Chinese immigration on California and Australia. By the 1880s and 90s, most of the Australian colonies had enacted some restrictions on Chinese immigration. Still, British imperial policy prohibited categorical exclusion. The historian Benjamin Munford has argued that the Chinese question in Australia was really two separate questions, separate but related, involving different interests: a colonial or local question about immigration, and an imperial question about British commerce and diplomacy with China. In the 1880s and 90s, these two questions became increasingly at odds, straining both Anglo-Australian and Sino-British relations. It was only with federation and self-governance in 1901 that white Australia came fully into its own. The new parliament quickly passed legislation that excluded Asian immigration, as well as laws that deported Pacific Islanders and excluded Aboriginal peoples from the franchise. Just a few years after Australian Federation in 1904, Chinese began to go to the British colony of Transvaal in South Africa to work in the gold mines on the Witwatersrand, which was and still is the largest producer of gold in the world. Between 1904 and 1910, the Transvaal Chamber of Mines imported over 60,000 Chinese for work on the Rand. This novel experiment was aimed at reviving the gold industry and addressing a shortage of native African labor after the South African War. It was also a ticking political time bomb in the post-war context, as South Africa's racial politics were still in flux. That is, it remained unresolved what would be the basis for reconciliation between whites, the British and Afrikaners, and what would be the policy of the whites towards native Africans. Unlike Chinese miners in North America and Australia, the Chinese mine laborers went to the Rand under contracts that set their wages and hours, forbade them from working in any other occupation or industry or from owning or leasing property, and required them to return to China at the conclusion of their contracts. But if Chinese mining laborers were indentured, they were not docile. They were well organized, with yihui, or righteous societies, on each mine. Within 6 months, the program faced a crisis of labor discipline and social control. Between 1904 and 1907, nearly 25,000 Chinese mine workers, more than a third of the total number of Chinese sent to work in South Africa, were convicted of various offenses, including refusing to work, rioting, staging work actions, deserting the compounds, as well as assault, manslaughter, and murder. 45 were sentenced to jail terms of 10 years or more, executed, or shot during disturbances. These statistics do not include the most pervasive form of resistance, which was a more passive kind of resistance, simple refusal to drill more than the minimum number of inches required to get paid, despite the use of the lash and other punishments. By 1906, the superintendent of the Foreign Labor Department, James Jameson, despaired that supervising Chinese mine laborers was a hopeless endeavor, indexing a general trend of declining efficacy in the use of Asian indentured workers in the European colonies. Soon, the problem became something quite larger than the specific demands of the mine labor program. There were sensational accounts in the Transvaal about Chinese mine deserters roaming the countryside and attacking Afrikaner farmsteads, and in Great Britain about floggings and other conditions alleged to be akin to slavery. The crisis assumed the incendiary symbolic force of the Chinese question, building upon a half-century of European experience with Chinese immigration to New World settlements. Not coincidentally, the white English-speaking skilled miners and artisans in the Transvaal included many Australian and Cornish workers who had traversed the mining circuits of the Anglo-American world. Australians who dominated the leadership of the South African trade unions were direct carriers of anti-Asiatic labor politics. The Chinese question on the Rand emerged as a key issue in two major political elections in 1906 and 1907, the general elections in Britain and the elections for responsible government or home rule in the Transvaal. Both elections brought new parties into power that spelled the speedy demise of the Chinese labor program and set broader trajectories into motion. In Transvaal, the Afrikaner Het Volk Party, led by the former Boer commandos Jan Smuts and Louis Botha, rode the Chinese question to power, setting the course that would lead the colonies to federate as the Union of South Africa in 1910 under the banner of radical white supremacy and racial segregation. South Africa joined Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as self-governing dominions of the British Empire, all based on white settler rule, native dispossession, and Asiatic exclusion. In Britain, the Chinese question helped the Labour Party overturned 20 years of nearly unbroken conservative rule in 1906 and galvanized the British trade unions to form an independent Labour Party, which would soon eclipse its Liberal ally as the main opposition to the Tories. A new angle of white labor interest came to the fore in the framing of the Chinese question in metropolitan politics. Like the liberals, the trade unions used the moral capital of anti-slavery in its rhetoric, but it would be fair to say that they were discontinuous with British abolitionist tradition. Only the British Anti-Slavery Society took a principled anti-racist position. That is, it opposed the system of indenture while supporting free Chinese immigration. British labor, however, like their cousins in the Dominions, and they were often quite literally cousins, believed the settler colonies were for British immigration and not for anyone else. Some scholars have associated these politics with an emergent imperial white working class, in which white workers across the Anglo-American world called upon their governments to protect them from both capital and the colored races. In the colonies, white labor gave popular support to elite political interests, which in a sense were rather parochial insofar as they sought power over their little particular node of the empire. The Chinese question gave them common cause and a global stage. For Great Britain, white settler autonomy was the price of developing Australia and South Africa inside the empire and not outside it like the United States. The Dominions got to have their cake and eat it too. They would be self-governing, but they would still receive the empire's protection from the proximate threats of yellow peril and black Africa. Thus, one may detect a certain completion in the circumnavigation of the Chinese question, its contours forged in crucibles of nation building on the frontiers of empires. From diverse local conditions, there emerged a common global discourse. The South African polemicist Lawrence Neame cogently summarized this thesis in 1907. Neame wrote that Asiatics were a danger to the white colonies because they would, quote, always underlive and undersell the Europeans, dragging down their wages and beating them at commerce to boot. He perceived a contest between the surplus populations of Europe and Asia over control of the temperate zones of the global South. Without strict barriers to Asiatic immigration, Neame feared that Europeans would lose that contest, lose by the numbers, lose by the cheapness of servile Asiatic labor, and in something of a contradiction, lose by the cleverness of Chinese and Indian business. But we should not forget the role of the United States in the coming of the global Chinese question. Not only was the coolie trope born in the American West, for white settler colonials in Australia and South Africa, the post-Civil War United States, that is, the United States of the 14th Amendment, was broadly speaking an object lesson in the folly of racial equality. Witness the consequences of unchecked Chinese immigration and Black Reconstruction. But so then did white America come to its senses and offer solutions of racial management, Chinese exclusion, and Jim Crow segregation. Solutions that inspired like policies in white Australia and segregated South Africa. If the first bricks of the Great Wall against China were laid by the United States, that wall grew and promoted the development of the American West, Australia, and South Africa as so-called white men's countries. So what general lessons can we glean from this travelogue? I want to suggest two. First, it suggests a distinction between prejudice and politics about the role of power in the production of difference. While tensions and conflict existed when Chinese and Euro-Americans first came together during the gold rushes, this alone did not produce Chinese exclusion. And I've been reading diaries here in the Huntington by white miners, and not all of them dislike Chinese. Some of them think they're quite cool. The Chinese question as a theory of racial danger and exclusion as a state policy emerged as constituent elements of nationalist politics. That was already abloom in the mid-19th century United States in racialized notions of continental expansion and the meanings of free labor. In the British settler colonies, the coolie trope emerged later as a central element of Australian nationalist ambition and the fashioning of the British Dominion. Second, I hope that a more expansive transnational perspective can help us appreciate the importance of Chinese exclusion as part of a dynamic interplay between Anglo-American expansion and Chinese containment. Imperialism's footprint in China was set down with opium, gunboat diplomacy, unequal treaties, and war indemnities, yes, but also from the exclusion laws. This wall protected and advantaged American and British territorial and economic expansion, which depended on control over land, resources, markets, labor, and not least gold, the foundation of credit. From another angle, the wall also contained China. Free immigration invariably begets commercial and cultural exchange. In 1852, two Chinese merchants in San Francisco, Habwa and Tong Achik, rebutted Bigler's address on the Chinese question with an astute argument that there was a positive relationship between immigration and trade. Whereas Bigler saw only hundreds of coolies disembarking in San Francisco, Habwa and Tong Achik saw both people and freight. They noted that many Chinese who originally came as miners were returning to California as merchants, merchants who not only sold Chinese goods, like rice, silks, and teas, but also a great quantity of American goods. They argued that trade, quote, cannot all be on one side. If you want to check immigration from Asia, they said, you will have to do it by checking Asiatic commerce, unquote. But Americans and Australians had another strategy in mind, an open door, yes, but one that swings only one way. Of course, it could not last forever. After World War II, decolonization loosened the regimes of exclusion, and at the end of the Cold War hastened a new era of global economic integration. A different world informs the Chinese question today. Today's anxieties about China's economic power as a new yellow peril are generated by contemporary issues of global economy and politics, but they also draw from a deeper history of ideas and forces that power their circulation and their rise to the status of a global idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mae. We have lots of time for questions. Our experience in this room is that if you shout your questions out, everybody can be heard. But if we have any doubt about that, we will endeavour to repeat the question from the podium. So the floor is yours. Questions? Hi there. Yeah.
Have you studied the economic benefits during the time of the Huntington, where Huntington actually benefited from the Chinese labor, and yet he's one of the top person who was supporting the Chinese Exclusion Act? And can you compare that with what is happening right now with the benefits of our Latinos, Mexicans, and the economic benefits to the society here?
Your paraphrase of this will be interesting. And you need to use the mic.
The lady wanted to know about Huntington's role in the economic benefits from Chinese labor and yet his support for Chinese exclusion. And then I was asked to compare that to Latino immigration and politics today. Is that a fair summary of your question?
How long have you got?
Well, I don't really know about Huntington's support for Chinese exclusion. By that time, the railroad had been built. So, you know, they had used the Chinese in the building of the railroad. And I would venture a guess to say that his support for exclusion was politically motivated. But I don't know. This is not something I've researched. I think the issue about immigrants and the perception that immigrants are a threat to native wages is something that is persistent throughout American history. It was also said about Eastern European and Southern European immigrants in the early 20th century, that they took jobs from native white Americans. And this is actually rarely the case. It's very rarely the case. When you have large-scale mass immigration, as you did in the late 19th century, as you did in the early 20th century, and as we have seen in our own time, These large-scale labor migrations are usually associated with not just an expanding economy, but with structural changes in the economy. So 100 years ago, that change involved a shift to industrialization. It was a shift to mass manufacturing and unskilled labor. So the millions of people that came from Italy, Hungary, Russia, et cetera, to work in the nation's factories and who built the cities were not actually taking jobs away from whites. They were actually filling new jobs that had been created by a structural change in the economy. And the kinds of jobs that native whites had, which were the people complaining, which were people who worked in skilled jobs, many of those jobs were being de-skilled, and they were under pressure, but the jobs weren't actually taken by the immigrants, right? In the latter decades of the 20th century, what we had is another kind of restructuring of the economy. You had a rise of finance and a rise of the service economy and a decline of manufacturing. So the Latino immigrants who do many of the service jobs in this country are not taking the jobs of steel workers in Pittsburgh, right? Those jobs, or they're not taking coal miners' jobs. I mean, those jobs are declining because of deindustrialization, because manufacturing now has gone overseas, and also because of automation, right? So the workers who come from Central America and Mexico and work in our fields picking crops, those are not the jobs that are being lost, right? So there's this disconnect in people thinking that the immigrants are taking Americans' jobs, but actually there's a whole restructuring going on of the economy, and there's a new supply of labor that comes to meet that. And why people oppose it, or why they say it's economic competition, is because that seems to be the most powerful and seemingly least racist explanation for opposing people who are different. So I hope that begins to answer some of your question. It's a very complicated issue that you raise.
Hi there. Go ahead. Sherry.
Very wonderful and impressive taking all of these countries, yet they're all really part of the British Empire.
That's right.
People went to South America, probably South Asia. Are you going to expand into that area as well to really make this truly a global look at this question, as you call it?
You're going to need to repeat that question.
Okay, so she pointed out that I'm mostly talking about the British Empire and asked if I'm going to address Chinese who went to South America and other places and write a truly global history. So, no. I have more modest ambition. I don't aspire to write a global history. But the story of the Chinese who go to the mining districts, I think, is something important to focus on, because it is the beginning of mass Chinese immigration to what we call the West, and it's the beginning of free immigration. So much of the Chinese who go to South America, who go to Peru or Cuba, they go as indentured workers, and it's a different kind of immigration. It's a different experience, and they do become part of those societies. Interestingly, most of them did not have exclusion laws because people were controlled by contracts. And they did also build communities, but they were smaller and more difficult because when you're importing workers under contract, you don't have the other kinds of people who come when you have voluntary migration. So when you had voluntary labor migrations, in their trail come merchants, newspaper editors, intellectuals, lawyers, all kinds of people. And so you have much more diverse and vibrant communities that appear in places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, but also in Sydney and Melbourne and places like that.
Hi there. Go ahead.
Out of curiosity, I think most of the Chinese laborers were coming out of the Japanese province. And what was the strand of the social classes coming out?
The Chinese who went to the gold fields in Australia and in the United States mostly came from Guangdong province. Many of them actually came from the same 4 counties in Guangdong province, the Siyi, or in Cantonese they say Sayup. And they were mostly rural people. They weren't the poorest people. The poorest people are not immigrants because they can't afford to go. So they're people from middling backgrounds. Kind of what we might call kind of semi-proletarians, rural proletarians. But there are also people who came from around Canton or Guangzhou who were merchants, who were more well-to-do, who were the businessmen. The 2 merchants I quoted at the end of my talk, they came from an area close to Canton. Now, the Chinese who go to South Africa, interestingly, came from northern China. They came from Tianjin and Shandong province. And that's an interesting story in and of itself, because when the when the British wanted to recruit Chinese to work in the gold mines in South Africa, they first went to southern China. They first went to Guangdong and Guangxi and Fujian, and they couldn't get anybody to sign up. And that's because by this time, by the early 20th century, people in southern China knew what it meant to sign a contract to go to a New World plantation colony. They didn't want to go. And there was also strong opposition from some local magistrates and even provincial leaders that made it illegal for British companies to recruit Chinese labor in their areas. And from a practical point of view, it was actually very common for Chinese in Guangdong province to go to Southeast Asia to work on short-term contracts. You could go for 6 months, and they were very loose. They were not indentures in the same way that what was going on for South Africa. So the work was still very hard. It was still arduous and difficult, but it was much closer to home, and you could just go back and forth whenever you wanted. So why would you want to sign on for 3 years in South Africa to work underground, right? So they went to northern China, and that was lucky for them because in 1904, the regional labor market of northern Chinese that went to Manchuria to work on similar short-term kinds of contracts, that labor market was disrupted by the Russo-Japanese War. So there was a large pool of unemployed people in northern China, and that's where they recruited people for the South African experiment.
So, Mae, you mentioned serial coolies who go from one of these contexts to another. Is it possible to trace individuals or families who go from California to Australia to South Africa?
Well, there are white people you can trace, but the Chinese don't have as, the records aren't as rich. But I did find one guy. I'll tell you this story. This is a good archive story. In South Africa, in Johannesburg, there was a very small Cantonese population that predated the mining experiment. These were Chinese who had come in the latter part of the 19th century to Cape Colony. Some of them went to the Transvaal when the gold rush opened there in the 1880s, but they were not allowed to mine, so they became merchants in what became Johannesburg. So there's a tiny little Chinatown in Johannesburg. And a man named Xie, who was born in Australia to a Cantonese merchant, and actually comes from a family that would be famous because his brother started one of the big newspapers in Hong Kong. But this guy, Xie, goes to Johannesburg just to go there, to try his hand at business. And he becomes the secretary of the Johannesburg Cantonese Club, or the Zhonghua Huiguan in Joburg. And when he hears about the mine labor experiment, he's interested in it. So he gets a job working for the East Rand Proprietary Mining Company, one of the biggest mining conglomerates on the Rand. And he is their translator, advisor. He goes to the mines, he talks to the Chinese workers, he hears their complaints, he registers them with his company, and basically they don't do very much to help the workers. So he wrote an article about his experience, which is one of the few Chinese language sources I've been able to find that's an eyewitness account of the Chinese mining in South Africa. Then he, at the end of this article, he says, well, I'm going to London to protest what's going on. Because in London, there is the Chinese ambassador to the British Empire is in London, right? There's a consul in South Africa, but the ambassador is Zhang Zheyi. He's in London, so he goes there. So I said, I wonder what happened when he went to London. So I went to the National Archives at Kew, and I looked through volumes and volumes of Foreign Office and Colonial Office records, and I found him. And they call him something like Thomas C, which is a Cantonese rendering of Xie. And there's this paper trail that follows him from South Africa to London, from the mine company saying, don't trust this guy, we met with him and he lied, and now he says he's going to London, and we're telling you he's a liar. And he goes to London and he says, well, they tried to make me sign a piece of paper that said everything was fine in the mines, but I wouldn't sign it. And then he goes to visit the Chinese legation, and he's stonewalled by a British guy who works in the legation, who's in with this network. So it's interesting how there's this communication among both the Chinese and among the British. But that was a lucky find.
Do you have any actual global numbers about the immigration? I'm under the impression that there was actual more immigration to Southeast Asia in sheer numbers than any of these other places.
Sure.
So can you give any numbers at all? Or
Sure. Well, there's about 250,000 Chinese who go to Australia, North America. This is between, 1850 and World War I. About 250,000, maybe a little more. There's several million. I don't know the exact number, but it's in the range of the millions who go to Southeast Asia. And there's 30 million who go, northern Chinese, who migrate north to Manchuria. So these are regional labor markets, and I think what's important here is part of my thinking about how exclusion laws contained China, because it stopped long-distance migration, and it made labor migration much more a regional phenomenon, both in terms of Southeast Asia and North Asia, right? So if there had not been these exclusion laws, Chinese would have continued to migrate to the West. I'm including Australia in the West. Obviously, it's not in the West, but.
There's one part of the British Empire that seems to be missing, and that's England. And what was it like in England for the Chinese, or did very many migrate there?
There were a few, not many, because the migration mostly was a labor migration that went to either plantation colonies or to the settler colonies, right? There were Chinese, though. There were a small Chinese community in London in the 19th century. Some of them had been seamen on ships and who settled there, but it was small. It was fairly small. And you don't really have migration from, there's a much larger South Asian migration that goes to Britain, because that's a direct colonial route, right? In Chinese from Hong Kong, some moved to England, but most of them moved to Australia and Canada, I think, where the weather's better, you know?
Migrated to England, and they weren't exactly welcome.
Well, that's true. That's definitely true. Later, after World War II, you have much more immigration to the British Isles from the British colonies, not least from the Caribbean, Afro-Caribbeans, and from South Asia. And Chinese are a much smaller migration stream to England because they don't have the same direct colonial networks that people went there. And also there's no citizenship benefit, right? Whereas until they changed the laws, I think in the 80s, if you came from one of the Caribbean Commonwealth nations or from South Asia, you had legal standing as a British subject. Right.
I'm going to take one last question.
The United States at times reduced the amount of Chinese women coming into the United States. How did these other countries, did they do the same policies?
Well, okay, so the first Chinese exclusion law in the United States was 1875. It was the Page Act. I'm sure many of you know about the Page Act, which excluded Mongolian prostitutes. And then, so the assumption was that all Chinese and Japanese women were prostitutes. I mean, it was not true, but that was the assumption. So many women who might have come heard about their interrogation and their kind of rude treatment upon arrival, so didn't come. But there's another reason why the immigration of women was low, and it's not just because of the exclusion laws. Because Chinese family custom is for the wife to stay in the home of the husband's family. And so, this is an age-old practice. So when a family sends a son abroad to work, one way of keeping him tethered to the patrilineal home is by having the wife there, keeping the wife there, right? So women typically did not immigrate in large numbers, and those women who came tended to be the wives of merchants who could legally have families in America, and often came and practiced a kind of transnational business pattern, so they went back and forth, but they actually settled and raised families in the United States, whereas most of the laborers did not see themselves staying permanently, even if many of them did stay for many years. So you had similar practices in Australia, not so much because women were excluded, because they weren't by law, but more from custom, I mean, Australia is also interesting because they didn't have anti-miscegenation laws as they did in the United States. So I found in my research in Australia, not a lot, but many more than you would find in the United States, examples of Chinese men who married white women and settled down. Usually they married Irish women. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I'm not an American citizen, and I can't speak to the electoral politics after what happened in November, but I can speak to Brexit. And I do feel that one of the tragedies of what happened in Great Britain in the summer of last year was that there'd been no possibility of a rational, sensible debate in the British polity about the benefits of immigration. And the politicians who made such a mess of that should really have talked to Professor Mae Ngai.
I'm available if they want to. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your ongoing support of our programs. Coffee and cookies are served outside. Please join us.